Good evening, everyone. Today is December 20th, 2020, and I'm pleased to be with you again for another virtual town hall. I'm also thankful for the Georgia chapter of the Lupus Foundation of America, headed by Terry Iman and the gang, as well as the Georgia Council for Lupus Education and Awareness, and the Emory University School of Medicine, along with the Georgians Organized Against Lupus cohort research study. So thank you for being with us again. Please be sure to review the disclaimer that went out with the email and that's on the website, that basically you shouldn't just go on what I'm presenting here, and to always talk to your physician regarding medical advice pertaining to you. So we have the worldwide numbers here, and you see the US continuing to be far and away ahead in terms of active infections, total infections, as well as deaths, and followed by India, Brazil, Russia, France, Turkey, the UK, Italy, Spain, and Argentina. In terms of hotspots over the past week regarding new cases, not only do we have total number of cases very high in the US, we continue to have a lot of new cases. And our neighbors to the north, Canada, um, and to the south of Mexico, continue to have significant cases as well. You can still see a lot of hotspots in South America. Europe is, as what we've all been hearing, with a lot of cases, and you'll see the very dark red in certain parts of Eastern Europe, as well as Sweden here. And then you don't see much in Asia, but I do know that South Korea, even though they're not really lit up, they've had more cases than they've ever had since the start of the pandemic. It's just not as bad relative to other parts of the country like the US. So, this just always reminds us that you shouldn't rest on our laurels, that this is a virus that continues to circulate and have impact throughout the world, but it continues to have a lot of impact in certain parts of the country and the world as well. This is very small type. It's meant to just highlight the number of cases per 100,000. So that way you compare apples to apples. When you have a big country versus a small country, you can't look at total number. But if you reduce it to a number per 100,000, then you can compare apples to apples. And you see very large numbers of cases per 100,000 in a lot of countries up here, but they're relatively smaller countries. You're talking Lithuania, Liechtenstein, Georgia here is the country of Georgia, not the state of Georgia. And then other parts of Eastern Europe, and then Sweden, as I pointed out. And then you have here the United States. And so with such a big country that's so diverse in terms of population and urban versus rural, all different climates, it really is remarkable that the US continues to have such an amazingly high rate of new cases. But that's what it is. And it really stands out in the midst of these much smaller countries that, on an apples to apples comparison, we are unfortunately equal to in terms of large numbers of new cases. The only other larger country, relatively speaking, would be the United Kingdom here, that kind of comes in. They're a bit lower. And speaking of England, you might have heard that they are going to be on a full down lockdown throughout London and parts of southeastern England. They'll enter what they call a tier 4 COVID-19 restrictions tonight. And it's the highest possible level of restrictions in England. And it effectively renews the lockdown that was seen at the very start of the pandemic. So by 7 p.m., actually last night, there were no seats on trains because people were trying to get out of the areas that are in big lockdowns, and that actually accomplished the opposite of what they're aiming for. And the fear is that because of all these people that are leaving and cramping themselves into packed trains, that they're effectively spreading the virus. And one of the reasons that they are um, acting in this fashion is not only the increased number of cases, but also that there's new scientific evidence that a new strain of the virus was spreading more quickly, and that this particular strain was more infectious than previous strains. This is the heat map of the US, and as you can see, it's all very hot in terms of number of new cases. You may remember in previous weeks, we pointed out to the upper Ohio Valley and the upper Midwest being the having largest number of new cases per day, and they continue to have very large numbers. But you see the darkest of red starting to concentrate a bit more now in other areas. And what stands out near our region is Tennessee and parts of Alabama, and going up into Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And you can see from Kentucky to Oklahoma to Texas, and then out west into Arizona, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. But again, I mean, it's still very hot throughout the country. And again, underscoring what we've been hearing about is that the number of new cases throughout time, we're at the highest we've ever been, and it continues to go higher, and we expect it to be even higher in the coming weeks. And then deaths will lag behind the new cases, but you can already see the death counts going up. And reflection of all of that is the number of hospitalizations that continue to go up throughout the country. Now, going back to what I pointed out in the map, again, comparing apples to apples, regardless of the size of the state, we're looking at the number of cases, new cases per 100,000 in the population. We have Tennessee that has the highest rate of new cases in the country, followed by California, Rhode Island, Arizona, Nevada, Indiana, Oklahoma, Alabama, Delaware, and Utah. We are relatively not as bad in Georgia, although we'll get to our numbers in a minute. I do want to point out, just again, reminding us that the cyclical nature of the virus is that it's not where we are now, but where we could be tomorrow. That's equally, if not more important. And our neighbors, Tennessee and Alabama, I think that's just a harbinger of where we could be. And we can sit here and be relaxed and thankful that we're not as bad as these areas, but we can very quickly turn. So we need to watch that. And just to further underscore the number of cases that we're seeing in these areas, if we ranked the number of cases per million population of the states compared to other countries, Tennessee, Rhode Island, Arizona, and Ohio are effectively number 1, 2, 3, and 4 when compared to any other country in the world. And it's not until you hit number 5 that you start seeing a country instead of a state. And then number 7 is Georgia, the country, not the state. So again, our neighbor just to the north of us has the highest rate of new COVID cases in the entire world, and by quite a bit, actually. So we need to be very careful. So we talked a lot about the new cases, and we know that deaths unfortunately follow as a proportion of the number of new cases. And so one question to throw out that I've seen is think about the deadliest days in American history. It's a nice kind of quiz, I guess. So here, and this is through December 7th. The deadliest day in the US history was the Galveston hurricane. But then in early December, we have several days of COVID that those days alone ranked number 5, 6, 7, and 8, just behind September 11th and ahead of Pearl Harbor. And we know in this past week that the deaths in the day passed the 3,000 mark threshold. So we've already crossed into number 3 in terms of some of the days related to COVID. And so this has gotten a lot of play throughout social media and on Twitter. But again, it's just very sobering to think about these numbers again and to remind us and keep reminding us that we can't rest. We want to, I know it's very tiring, but it has to be reinforced. I do know that the pandemic of 1918, we don't have accurate numbers. So those numbers may be as bad or maybe even worse than some of these numbers. We just don't know. So this is the recent Georgia heat map, and this is where you can see areas that are particularly hot in terms of new cases. And I pointed out Tennessee in terms of being the highest rate of any area in the entire world. And you can see the spillover. You know, these borders are just maps, lines on a map. They're not going to keep COVID out. And you can already see the northern part of the state being relatively higher in terms of rates compared to some of the other parts of the state, although there are pockets, obviously, that are greater in different areas. So the number of new cases in Georgia continues to go up, and it will continue to go up, unfortunately, over the next several weeks. There's no doubt about that. The deaths, we don't see the sharp rise that we see in the US, larger numbers, but that's because the number of new cases have been rising relatively recently, and it's just a matter of time before the death numbers start to go up in this state. And you see the positivity in terms of how many tests are positive are going up, and the hospitalizations are going up as well. And it's already crossed the threshold in terms of the highest number of hospitalizations that we've seen throughout the pandemic, which prior to this recent time was back in the summer. And that all leads us to us being back in the red zone. And remember, they had to create a dark magenta red because there were so many places already in the highest tier. So we're not in the darkest red yet, but obviously we're creeping up. And that's because we have a lot of new cases. The infection rate is high, as reflected by the positivity test rate. The ICUs have room, but they are starting to continue to go up and are in the red zone. And so that's making us all very cautious going forward. So I'd like to continue to talk a bit more about what we discussed last week regarding the big news lately, in addition to the high number of cases, are the vaccines. And we now have 2 vaccines that are approved and granted emergency use authorization by the FDA. One is the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. That was the first one out. And then just in the past few days, the Moderna vaccine. And just to give you an idea of how quickly this all came about, so this is how long it took for previous vaccines to be developed. And they can take years, if not decades. We're talking about the shingles vaccine taking nearly 30 years to develop. The flu vaccine that you can get through the nose, that we discourage people with autoimmune or immunosuppressed conditions to get because it has very small amounts of live virus. But that flu-mist nasal vaccine took 28 years to also develop. The HPV vaccine, 15, rotavirus, 15. And so you get the picture. I mean, it takes years and years, whereas COVID took 18 months. And I know that is a significant reason for concern for a lot of people in terms of it being rushed. And so just to discuss that process, this is a typical timeline for those other vaccines that we discussed. there's a period of time. If we were going through a typical process now to create a vaccine, we probably wouldn't have a vaccine until 2033. And that's because in a typical process, it takes a couple years or so to do just the basic research to study and understand the shape, the characteristics of the virus, how it gets transmitted, what would be the best way to approach it in terms of developing a vaccine. And then we go through a preclinical process, phases 1, 2, and 3. And then you build the factories to then manufacture. You gain approval finally, and then you distribute. Now, what happened with Operation Warp Speed was it did not cause any of those steps to be skipped. And so all of the traditional steps, all of the safety measures that must be met in all the previous vaccines were maintained in the development of the COVID vaccines, but the process was greatly condensed so that we were able to get the vaccine in a very short period of time. And if we started today, it would be out in August 2021. So we all lived through the early talk of the pandemic and then how quickly we got to this point. And that's because these processes were in order, but they were shrunk down. And by that I mean, previously, these vaccines in general are not big money makers for the pharmaceutical companies. So they have to be very cautious. So they want to go through each step individually, finish that, and then go to the next step. And the big money is in the development, but even the bigger money is getting the factories to manufacture and to have it produced to go out. So those two big areas all had to be done sort of cautiously and with the money from the pharmaceutical companies. And what the process happened with the government being involved in Operation Warp Speed was that we, the people, through the US government, gave billions of dollars to reduce the risk to the companies. They were assured that they would get paid for the building of factories and the manufacture, which started even before the results came in. So this was a risk, obviously, a risk that the government took on, in that one of these vaccines would make it through all phase 3 of the approval process. But instead of waiting for that to happen, that even started earlier. And then through the phase 1, 2, and 3, instead of waiting for the phase 1 trials to finish, we started planning phase 2 even as the phase 1 was still ongoing, so that everything was in place. And only if the phase 1 trial results showed efficacy and safety did it go into the phase 2. So after phase 1, it goes through phase 1, it would go directly into phase 2 because the groundwork had already been laid and people could go be recruited into phase 2. And then as people were finishing the phase 2 study, the phase 3 was already being planned, so that once the results came in for phase 2, and if it was safe and effective, then they would go straight into going into the studies and recruiting patients. And then once you finish phase 3 and it was safe and effective, they already had the factories built, they already had the vaccine manufactured, and all they were doing is waiting for the approval, and the distribution would happen shortly afterwards. It's absolutely amazing. And I think as people reflect on it in the field, it's just mind-boggling how all the pieces fit together. And not because it was skipped, but because the entire world's cognitive power was focused on this. Multiple countries were involved, multiple pharmaceutical companies were involved, and billions of dollars in taxpayer money were used to also grease the wheels, if you will. So what do these vaccines target? And they target the S protein, these red dots, what we call the spike protein. And it's been recognized from early on in knowing what these coronaviruses are, is that these spike proteins are the ones that are obviously very obvious when you look at it from the surface. And so they're very good targets for the immune system, and they don't tend to change very much across the corona viruses. And so hopefully this thing that we're seeing in England with the mutation, I'm not hearing that it's anything in terms of mutation of the S protein so that the vaccines are not as effective. But what's happening is that there's mutations in other aspects of the virus that's making them apparently um, more infectious. It takes less of the viral particles to actually make somebody sick and infected than previous strands. Um, but hopefully the S protein, which has been so far a really good target and not changing very much, that is the target of the vaccines that have been undergoing development and also have been approved. And this is a slide from last week. If you haven't seen last week's, 2 weeks ago, the town hall, I did a broader review of some of the vaccines at that point. And so please go back and download that from the LFA Georgia website and take a look. But just to remind you that there are two vaccines that are mRNA vaccines that are approved, the ones at the top row here, the Pfizer and the Moderna. They have good efficacy data, they work immunologically, they met their primary endpoint. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about the reactogenicity. These others down here are either in phase 3 or just about to go into phase 3 studies. The three here in color, the second and third row, are in phase 3 studies. I talked briefly last week or 2 weeks ago about the AstraZeneca vaccine and how there's a little uncertainty as to exactly how effective it is, because it was given in 2 parts of the world and it was accidentally given in half the dose in one part of the world, and it turned out to be more effective in that group. So they're probably going to redo that study. It's done with it's a vector vaccine using adenovirus, and we can talk about this in the future, but it's a different way of making a vaccine than the mRNA. The Janssen and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a similar type of vaccine to the AstraZeneca. What's fascinating about this one is that it's a 1 dose instead of 2 dose like all the others, and it's currently enrolling as well. And I do know that this is a study that's going on in Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, so in the pediatric population. The ones at the bottom here, there's the Novavax and the Sanofi product here at the very bottom. These are more traditional vaccines in the sense that they get little bits of the virus, or specifically that spike protein, and give it to people. So there's no way, because it's not the whole virus, there's no way that an individual can get infected with the coronavirus or get COVID from the shot, but it teaches the body to recognize the coronavirus or COVID-19 virus and be able to fight it off better. So this is one that is still in phase 3. The Sanofi product will have a little bit delay, and it's going to go into phase 3 in early 2021. The thing about the mRNA vaccines, we'll talk a little bit about in a second. Hold on, sorry. And so this is a good slide just to kind of compare the different COVID vaccines. The two in the middle here are the ones that are available in the US now, Moderna and Pfizer. They are the mRNA vaccines. They're given twice with really great efficacy in the 90s. They have to be kept very cold because of the characteristics of the mRNA vaccine, which I'll talk about in a second. And the other types of vaccines that are using a different method are currently finishing up different phases, and they require mostly 2 shots. Um, they have different efficacy, but they seem to be pretty good so far and good safety as well. And it's good to have multiple options here, not only because we don't have enough of these other vaccines in terms of pure number, but also because of issues like refrigeration. This Oxford vaccine is regular refrigeration temperature, whereas, as you're hearing, the RNA vaccines require very cold temperatures. And why is that? Well, the mRNA is what is the key to the current vaccines. These are very sensitive to temperature. Unless they're kept extremely cold, because they're so fragile, they will, after a few hours, disintegrate. And so that's one of the key issues with the mRNA vaccines. But if you are able to keep it cold and you get it into somebody, what the mRNA does is that this is the blueprint that teaches the cell to make certain proteins. We all have mRNA. It comes from our DNA, the code of life. It codes for everything. And these mRNAs are from the DNA in our bodies. But we're able to, with technology nowadays, to sequence the DNA of viruses, and we can create the mRNA sequence of different parts of that virus. So it's amazing what science can do, but the scientists have created the mRNA code that allows our body to use that code to create the spike protein using our own cells. Now, it doesn't mean that we're creating coronavirus. We're just creating a very, a part of the COVID-19 virus that does not cause infection or does not cause any harm, but is on the surface of the virus that our body can see. And that's important because our body then gets taught by having these spike proteins from the coronavirus in our bodies, it gets taught to remember what they look like and create antibodies, which are the things that can help fight against that particular virus that has that spike protein, in this case, the COVID-19 virus. So we have antibodies, we have memory in our immune cells to then fight off these COVID-19 viruses in the future after we get the vaccine. This mRNA technology is something that we could use. It's not an easy thing to do, obviously, but it's easy enough that it makes the process relatively quick. Like I said, scientists were able to sequence the DNA of the COVID-19 virus relatively quickly, and we're able to create this mRNA faster than any other method for vaccines. And that's why the mRNA vaccines came first. This technology, even though it's not been part of any licensed vaccine to date, up until the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine for COVID, it's not a new technology overall. It's been pursued for Zika, rabies, influenza, and cancer. And it's been studied for nearly 10 years. And when the COVID-19 virus came about, and we knew that we needed multiple ways of trying to figure out how to get a vaccine, people jumped on this mRNA technology knowing that it had promise and we could get something relatively quickly. If you're wondering about this whole thing about DNA that I mentioned, I know it can cause some anxiety for some people. The mRNA does not enter into our DNA. It does not change our DNA. It's impossible. So it's not going to cause genetic defects in us or in our future families. It is something that only triggers our current cells to produce the spike protein virus that, again, is it does not cause any harm to us. It doesn't give us the COVID-19 infection. So here's our first question. Would the healthcare providers know how to treat all the reactions from the COVID-19 vaccines that are being distributed? And how are they different from general allergic reactions? And how do lupus patients know if a reaction is a flare-up or from COVID-19 vaccine? So I also got about this last 2 weeks ago. Please go back and review that. When we talk about reaction to vaccines, we talk only about very short-term reactions. So what happens within a few days, either right away or within few days of getting the vaccine? And what we worry about the most are medically important events attributed to vaccination, things that cause harm and are severe enough to want to get most people hospitalized or have significant effects on people and their health. There are extremely, extremely few adverse events. What we do have, depending on the vaccine, and we're learning that with the Pfizer and Moderna COVID vaccines, that there is kind of in line with some of the vaccines that are already out there, a decent amount of reactogenicity. They are causing our immune system to react. They're working, in other words. But the way that it triggers the body to react in a positive way will lead to some degree of these various symptoms: soreness, redness at the site of injections, muscle aches and pains, fatigue, headache, even some nausea, vomiting, or fever. And some of these can be more severe, but the vast majority of people don't get any of this, by the way. But the ones that do tend to be mild. And there's a very small number that have more severe symptoms. And the more severe ones are not going to be the ones that are so medically important and significant that require hospitalization, but they may cause people sick to feel ill enough that they may not go to work or don't feel up to going to doing their usual line of activity for a day or two. But these things will go away in a day or two if you get any of these symptoms, and you may not. And so that's really the main thing. The points are, these are very unusual, and if they happen, they'll be short-term effects that only last a couple days or 3 days at the most. And at day 3, and usually no later than day 3, people will go back to where they were before. And if we don't know what these vaccines do in people with lupus and other autoimmune issues, and I'll touch on this again in a minute, but if it were to cause a lupus flare, and again, you may not be able to tell the difference between these symptoms and a lupus flare, the way to tell the difference is that the reactogenicity, or the reaction that we expect from some people from the vaccine, will go away in a couple days. If people with lupus were to get this vaccine or a similar vaccine in the future and develop some of these symptoms that is consistent with previous lupus flares, it would obviously be something that would persist beyond 2 or 3 days immediately after getting the vaccine. So in terms of the reactogenicity, this is what this slide is talking about, what we expect to happen in a smaller number of people, but only lasts for a couple of days. And I talked a bit before about the Shingrix vaccine, which is the shingles vaccine. And that is those that are getting the vaccine against shingles here. This is the one that's really noted to be the one previous to the COVID vaccines that caused them potentially the most amount of reactogenicity. And I told you about my story of getting the first shingles shot, and I was not feeling like I wanted to do anything. And if it wasn't the weekend, I probably would have tried to stay out of work unless I absolutely had to go. That's how poorly I felt, but I felt fine on day 3. And so this Shingrix vaccine is known to cause pain. local pain, that is, at the site. And it tends to be mild in the vast majority of cases in 3/4 of people. Some redness, some swelling, and then you can see about half of the people will have some muscle aches and fatigue, headache, some chills, and even fever in 20%, and GI symptoms. So overall, about a third of people will get some degree of noticeable symptoms. But again, they tend to be mild and they completely go away no later than 3 days. And you can see here the Pfizer COVID vaccine has similar numbers in terms of local site injection pain, but much less in terms of redness, swelling, muscle aches, fatigue is about the same. Headaches are similar. The chills are about half of what you see in Shingrix. Much less fever, thank goodness, and GI symptoms. And just to share with you, I actually got my first shot of Pfizer, the COVID vaccine, through Emory yesterday. Yes, yesterday. And I feel fine. I was a little bit nervous, to be honest with you, because I had such a strong reaction to Shingrix. They are different vaccines, so I knew in my mind, logically speaking, there doesn't have to be a correlation. But still, having gone through what I did with the Shingrix, I would have taken the Shingrix vaccine again, by the way, and I would have done it with the Pfizer, even if I got similar symptoms. But I'm glad to report that, at least for myself, I didn't have any symptoms. And so here you see the flu shot in terms of its numbers. And so I've heard people kind of say that the Pfizer and probably the Moderna vaccine are somewhere in between the Shingrix and the flu shot in terms of some of these reactogenic symptoms that people get. Now, remember, we're only talking very short term, a couple days after the vaccine, and this is from 2 weeks ago. There are absolutely no evidence for long-term effects of vaccine. We're talking years down the road in terms of multiple things. And I know people have read in various sources about vaccines causing this and that. I'm telling you, I mean, vaccines have been studied more than the vast majority of medical issues and treatments that are out there. And there have been millions upon millions of people getting vaccines for a lot of different things, not just COVID. And there's just been no association with long-term issues. We're only talking short-term. So this was actually a question that came through after the first dose of Shingrix. How long should I wait for the COVID-19 vaccine? Because Shingrix is a 2-shot vaccine. So I'm in the same boat as you. I've gotten my first shot of Shingrix. I have not gotten my second shot. Mine is due sometime between February and April, I think, or maybe even January. But anyway, it's coming up. But I got my COVID shot, and no one really knows how long to space them. But I think from what I've heard from most experts, and again, this is just expert opinion, it should be relatively safe to, one, get them at some point and overlap with each other. But people generally recommend that you wait at least a couple weeks between shots of any type, whether it's the Shingrix or the flu or whatever. Just space them out at least a couple weeks. Know that when you do get your first COVID-19 vaccine from Pfizer or Moderna, your next one is going to be 21 or 28 days after that. So you probably won't be able to get a shot in between your COVID vaccines, at least of the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines that are available now. We touched a bit about this 2 weeks ago, more on a national level, but this is just to remind us that even though that the shots are out, it's going to take time for everybody to get them, but you will get them. This was as of, I think, Friday, that Georgia received 72,000 doses of the Pfizer vaccine. And we're talking the first people in line are healthcare workers and nursing home residents, and these are 557,000 people. And so if you take 72,000 out of 557, it's only 13% of these first in line groups that are going to get vaccinated with the first batch of Pfizer vaccine. So very small, but we know we're getting doses each and every day, and we're getting the Moderna vaccine now that it's been approved. And that's why it's important for those other studies to continue. There are a lot of other COVID vaccine studies that are ongoing that hopefully will lead to other approvals, and we'll have multiple sources of these vaccines that go out. And maybe there will be a point at which people can get a choice between one or the other, and we can talk about it then. But at this point, as long as things are relatively safe and effective between the vaccines, what we're trying to get is the vaccine. So people in general to be vaccinated if they can and will want to get vaccinated as quickly as possible, regardless of what company it's from. So we'll get there. We talked about this herd immunity concept, and what we're trying to do with the vaccinations is to get herd immunity. Right now, we don't have much herd immunity. We have infected people in contact with people that are susceptible. They have not had COVID before, or they have not had the COVID vaccine. And so there's too many of these susceptible people. And that's why we're having such great numbers of infections and therefore such large numbers of death and devastation really throughout the world. So we can't achieve herd immunity until we have about 60-70% of people immune. Yes, some of these people will be immune because they got COVID recently, but we do not want to get to this point by going through the process of just letting people get infected because we're not even close to this, and look at the devastation that we're having worldwide. So this is not the way to get to this point. Immunizations are. And so that's where we are. We're starting to get more and more of these people that are green, that are immune. Of course, we'll have people that won't get the vaccine or can't get the vaccine for some reason. And just like with the flu shot, there are people that walk around without getting the flu vaccine, but we hope to get enough people vaccinated for whatever it is that we're trying to protect so that more people are immune than not immune. And that provides the vaccine fewer and fewer ways to get transmitted. So it's going to take us a while to get to this point where we have enough people vaccinated. This is one estimation of how we might or when we might get to herd immunity. Herd immunity is at least 60%. It's probably closer to 70-80%. But here, the purple line is the percentage of the people in the population that are recently infected with COVID and have immunity, probably at least 2 or 3 months worth. And so, people are getting infected all the time. And so you have those who survive have a certain amount of immunity. And then what we want to do is replace that over time with more and more people getting the vaccine. And so as the vaccine becomes more widely available, when we have other options, we'll get to the point where when you add vaccinated people with those who have immunity from getting infected, we'll have a total number of immune people that cross the 60% threshold, maybe sometime in late summer, early fall. Don't think that by July, August, September, things are going to be completely normal. This is just, number one, an estimate. And number two, there are a lot of other things that we need to do in addition to having people continue to get immunized to get low enough transmission of the virus. So even though we can get up to this point, there's still a lot of people that are not immunized, and the virus is still going to be transmitting around. And we need to make sure that we have multiple layers of protection that we eventually can start peeling back, but it's not a matter of, oh, we crossed the 60% threshold and now we can stop wearing masks and we can just go back to life as normal. We will, over time, get closer to a normal life, but it requires multiple steps along the way. And this is one way to kind of illustrate how we need to go through this. This is the Swiss cheese uh, way of looking at how we get protected from the virus. So here's the virus here trying to get to a person that is trying to infect. And we know that vaccinations right here is just one slice, but vaccinations are not perfect, right? It's not 100% effective. Not maybe some people won't get the second dose. It's not widely available yet. So it's viruses will get through this hole. And everything else here that you see are not perfect either, but the more barriers we produce between us and the virus, the less penetration the virus will have into people and the less infections will occur. We will start isolating the virus into smaller and smaller subsets of people. And that's when the transmission becomes really low and we can start peeling back some of these things, whether it's hopefully reducing some of the social distancing measures. Certainly we won't have quarantine and isolation. We'll continue the vaccines and the masking and so forth. At some point, the Lord willing, will be able to be minimized or even stopped altogether. So please know that when you start hearing about herd immunity and vaccines, we focus on those things, but we can't forget all these other things. It's going to take a very layered approach in time. Even though herd immunity numbers, we may get there in the late summer or fall, it's going to take some time after that before we start seeing the transmission rates go lower and lower, the virus being isolated in smaller pockets, and we can change some of these measures. Some of the good news that has come out in terms of children is that this is a study recently by the CDC where you might have heard that when they compared children who did not get COVID versus those who did, and they compared the two, the children um, who who became COVID positive were more likely to have been in public gatherings or large group gatherings like weddings and parties and homes, play dates, and unfortunately funerals. But they were not more likely to have COVID if they attended school. So that just really underscores the fact that schools are relatively safer than other places that they go to. And it has given more assurance to organizations to try to keep the schools open. But what we do need to do is have the kids isolate to the best of their ability in terms of all these other things that they're doing outside of school. But that's good news in terms of keeping them in school as much as possible if they and the teachers obviously can have the proper precautions and the distancing. So going into some of the questions, other questions, do people already in the hospital and have COVID, and I'm assuming you meant the COVID vaccine. I'm not sure what the BBC vaccine is, but and this all goes, I think what you're asking is if people get infected with COVID, do they or when should they get the COVID vaccine? So it's extremely rare for people who have had COVID to get reinfected in less than 2 or 3 months. So we don't know exactly how long that immunity lasts, but I'm hearing mostly that if you have had COVID infections, that you probably do not need a COVID vaccine for about 90 days, but you should eventually get a COVID vaccine. So just because you have had COVID does not mean you're immune for the rest of your life, which is basically what you're saying. And so you do need that COVID vaccine. And by the way, we probably will need ongoing COVID vaccines because the COVID vaccine itself is not going to be permanent. And hopefully it'll last many months and we'll just need about an annual booster or so. But in any case, if you've had COVID, whether they're in the hospital or not, after 90 days, you should get vaccinated if you have the opportunity to. So I heard part of a report that people with certain autoimmune diseases should perhaps not get vaccinated, at least not yet. And of course, they should consult their physicians. So we talked about this also 2 weeks ago at the end. We just don't know. And that's the question behind people with autoimmune or immunosuppressed conditions, that those people were not part of the initial studies to get these vaccines approved. There's reason to believe that they are going to be safe and effective in most people with autoimmune conditions, including lupus. But there are some theoretical concerns going the other way. So we just need more information. And unfortunately, we don't have that yet. And so it's unknown, like a lot of things in COVID, but a lot of other things in COVID over time, we should have a better idea. And I do know that there are a lot of efforts in the early phases to start looking at the response of the COVID vaccine in people with lupus and other autoimmune conditions. So whether anybody should take lupus, whether they have well-controlled disease or not, it's unclear. And again, it's that discussion that you're going to have with your physician. But we will try to get you as much updated information to help you all in your decision making as possible. Are there findings that people with overactive immune systems like lupus may have more long-term, long hauler symptoms from COVID? So for people who are not aware, there is people have discovered that a decent percentage of people who have COVID, even after the infection goes away, have long-lasting symptoms, and these are called long hauler COVID patients. There's different terms going around, but long hauler is one of the more common ones. And some of these people may develop autoimmune conditions too. We're learning about this. We don't know this very well. There have been conferences at the NIH. I listened in on one with Anthony Fauci and some other people. So the observation is that this syndrome, this issue of people long after their COVID infection having long-lasting symptoms, that's happening a lot more, and we are recognizing that it is a real entity. But as to what it means, what's exactly going on in the immune system and in whom, and what to do about that, we're just trying to figure that out. And in fact, at Grady and at Emory, we are developing a post-COVID clinic for those that have been infected, that have had chronic symptoms, to help us to at least understand this better, and also to facilitate our research and trying to figure out what we can do about this. So that's just for people without autoimmune conditions. Now, what happens to people with immune issues, like people with lupus, and after developing COVID, we're learning about that as well. And we hope that through GOAL, and for many of you, you're going to see some more questions come to us from GOAL along the lines of COVID and immunizations. This really is at the heart of very important questions that we just don't have any idea at this point. But we look forward to sharing with you more along these lines as soon as we hear. And we hope that if you all have any opportunities to participate and provide information so that we can learn more about this, that you would be willing to consider that. How many transplant patients were included in the COVID study? None. Will they be included in any future testing? The COVID world, the transplant world is very interested because they learned that early on in the pandemic that one of the risks for poor outcomes were people that were post-transplant, that were immunosuppressed. So they're very interested in learning about what happens. They don't have solid information as far as I know. I don't know exactly what sort of studies are going on in that area. Haven't had time to look, and I'm not an expert in that area. So I would, if you are a kidney transplant patient or an other type of organ transplant patient, please talk to your doctors in that area, because obviously they will be better knowing than I am. But as far as I know, and just like everything else, that they're not a part of the original studies, and everything is underway at this point. I do know that most experts, at least based on the way that the vaccines work uh, and previous vaccines in transplant patients, the COVID vaccines should be as safe and effective. But again, it needs to be tested and to determine better. So I guess my point is that it seems to be hopeful, but we need further information. And this is the last question. I recently submitted a request from home to work from home, but it was denied. And what do you do if you're asked to return to the office? And this is really beyond my specific expertise. I know as a clinician that I understand those with lupus suffer along so many different lines, and I'm here to help support on a medical level, and that is especially with support letters and filling out forms and anything I can provide the patient or the employer in terms of supporting the request. But when something's been denied, I have to defer to you all as experts to share amongst each other. I'm sure Terry would be able to connect you all with some people that may know in terms of your rights in the workplace. But I think COVID is really sort of uncovering a lot of these issues even more. I mean, this has been around way before COVID, right? In terms of employer accommodations, but especially in this era, I think it really opens to the needs of what we have in our community with regards to protections and so forth. And so this is just an even greater call for us to remain united, to think and consider the importance of advocacy, that these issues and questions may not pertain to you now, but they may in the future, or someone that you do know and love, and will always be around even after COVID. So please work with the LFA Georgia chapter, national chapter, other groups in terms of advocacy and sharing your information with how to best support each other along these lines. To remind you about the resources at the LFA, there's a specific COVID-19 vaccine and lupus resource page. So please be sure to check that out. I'm sorry we've gone long, so I'm not going to have time for specific questions from the chat room this time. But please continue to check out other updates and resources for lupus and COVID and all the other tremendous information on the Lupus Foundation of America Georgia chapter website. And keep your questions and comments coming. I appreciate all the words of support. So this has been our 41st virtual town hall. Can you believe it? But it's been a great journey, and we'll continue to have it going. With the holidays, however, if we continue along the lines of every 2 weeks, it will be January 3rd, but we're going to push that back one more week. So our next town hall will be 3 weeks from now, January 10th. So this will be sent out as a reminder from Terry through her emails and the website. So continue to check that, but just know that we'll meet again in 3 weeks. Have a happy holiday. Please be safe. And I know it's really hard, but to your best of your ability, try to exercise that social distancing in this time. It's so rough, but you can see the light. There is light. There is absolute light. And it's great that we're walking together to get to that light. And so I look forward to talking with you then. Take care. Good night.